I'm very honoured that both Phyllida and Richard have so generously agreed to take part in this project. They've not only been very much a part of shaping the exhibitions and its design, but they've also written text for the forthcoming publication about Olga Jevrić, which is published in association with Writing House, and it will be coming out in November. As you'll also see from your forms on the flyers on your seats, Phyllida and Richard have also very generously produced limited edition artworks to raise funds for that forthcoming book. And without their incredibly kind contributions, the book would not have otherwise been possible. So that's very much appreciated. But back to this evening. Very briefly, in terms of how this project came about, I first saw the work of Olga Jevrić at the Henry Moore Institute in 2016 in a display that focused on her proposals for monuments. I was immediately and immensely struck by her work. And like many of the visitors to the exhibition at Pier, I was a little bit embarrassed to admit to myself that I'd never even heard of her. But soon after seeing the work in Leeds, I visited Fedja Klikovac as the director of Handel Street Projects, when I alighted on the fact that he had a monograph on the artist, which is this book here. I discovered not only that he was hoping, not only was he hoping to arrange an exhibition of Olga Jevrić's work in his gallery, but he'd first met Jevrić while a student worked in Belgrade in the 1980s, and he'd been in contact with her very shortly before she died in 2014. He had been keen for some time to make an exhibition of her work in London, and so from that moment on, the idea to have a dual venue presentation was discussed and then came to fruition 18 months later. So the format of this evening's conversation will be quite informal, and I hope it will give us the opportunity to explore Jevrić's work from a range of personal as well as historical perspectives, but in a way perhaps mostly personal. There are people in the audience who have a greater, deeper understanding perhaps of the historical perspectives, and it'd be great if they wanted to contribute to the conversation too. Richard met Olga Jevrić while teaching in Belgrade over a number of years. He was introduced by his friend and artist Phyllida Barlow, who's also a good friend of Fedja Klikovac. Richard has written a wonderful essay that tells his story about his history of teaching at the art school in Belgrade and how through this he came to know the work of Olga Jevrić. Phyllida Barlow never met Jevrić, but had seen her work in reproduction, and also many years ago at the Hayward Gallery, I think, was in a large group exhibition, which was a survey show of work from the former Yugoslavia. Phyllida and I had the enormous pleasure and privilege spending 2 days in Belgrade earlier this year to look at Jevrić's work in 3 public collections that have loaned to the exhibition. Phyllida's text for the book is a poetic response to the work, which brings together the experience of this visit to Belgrade with her deep knowledge of sculpture from the 20th century. Before we hand over, I just wanted to make special thanks to the supporters and the lenders of the exhibition. The Henry Moore Foundation, where I first saw the work, have then gone on to support this exhibition, and also the Serbian Embassy in London. The Art Fund also helped support the research visits to Belgrade, which was incredibly generous of them. The 3 main lenders to the exhibition have been the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and Heritage House. And I should just say that the work that you see here has been borrowed from those 3, exclusively from those 3 institutions. And at the moment, none of the work is on public display in Belgrade. So we are having a wonderful treat to see that work collected together here. As I said at the beginning, I think it should be a sort of informal conversation. I think I'd like, in a way, for Phyllida and Richard to think about their response to the work and then see how that can tease out a conversation perhaps around how we respond to sculpture. That's what we've been talking about the fact that a lot of people have said to me and have come into the gallery and have said that they said, as I've mentioned before, with almost a sense of embarrassment that they're not familiar with the work. Well, there's good reason why they wouldn't be familiar with the work, because it hasn't had the opportunity for a lot of airing, but at the same time there seems to be a sense of knowing the work. It seems to have a sort of quality which people respond to in a very immediate way, and that's something else I think we can perhaps talk about. So I'm not going to be the interlocutor. I'm going to let you sort of leap in. And maybe this conversation should be about half an hour, something like that, 40 minutes. And then it'd be really great to have some other people's response from the floor, if you'd like. We've got a roving mic, which I can hand around later. So I don't know who would like to...
I'm going to start.
Thank you.
We agreed that before. I'm not just jumping in. And I think I was going to start quite anecdotally with how I first came across the work. As Ingrid said, I was teaching in Belgrade on an exchange with the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. For the week that I was there, it was quite an intense teaching week, and the museums in Belgrade were both closed, the National Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art, and had been closed for quite a long time for various reasons. Refurbishment would broadly cover the reasons. There was some danger of flooding in the Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Museum of and the National Museum had been closed for the previous 3 years, and continued to be closed even up to today. In fact, my colleague who I was teaching with, Merjan Bayek, arranged for me to have a visit to both museums, the National Museum and the Museum of Contemporary Art. And whilst I was looking through their sculpture collection, I saw a work in the corner of the storeroom, and I said, "That's interesting. Who's that by?" And it was a bronze work with kind of blobs attached to rods going through it, and the curator told me it was an artist called Olga Jevrić. So I looked at that quite closely, and it stuck in my head. And then I had a similar experience at the Museum of Contemporary Art, where the collection had been moved up from the ground floors because of the risk of flooding, and was now the galleries are now more like storerooms. And there was another work there that I saw and said, "That's interesting. Who's that by?" And the answer was the same. So I then I spoke to Merjan about it, and it turned out that he knew Olga Jevrić, and he said that maybe we were in the course of developing a project, that maybe it would be he could organise a meeting. And so I've been back and forth to Belgrade a lot, and in 2007, when I went back to sort of start really seriously working on the project that the both of us were doing, he told me that Olga had just given a group of her works to the Serbian Academy of Sciences, and she was the room that she was using would be open to visitors, and that she would be there if we organised the visit. So I think in 2008 all that was fixed up, and we went there. Now, the Serbian Academy of Sciences is a huge building, and you go in there, and we went up 3 floors, down corridors, and there's these corridors all have doors off them. So it's a little bit difficult to work out what it is you're going to see, or what you're going to meet. Then we came to a door, and Merjan knocked and came in, and we went into this room where, which is all of the academicians had their own rooms, and where Olga had cleared out the bookcases that lined the room, and installed 57 small works in these glass cases in the room. And I have to say this was one of the most intense sculptural experiences I've ever had, akin to visiting Judd's installations in the artillery sheds in Marfa, or seeing Buddhist temples at another point. That the extraordinary concentration and variety within this small space. So there were windows at one end, and then 2 lined shelves down one side, and at the back by the door another glass shelf with slightly bigger spaces where the bigger works were there. Now, Merjan so we were introduced to Olga, and then Merjan started talking to us, so I could go around myself and look at these works. And I found myself kind of profoundly moved by both the intensity of within these quite modestly scaled objects, their extraordinarily insistent material presence, and within a very almost limited range of materials, the enormous variety of I suppose expression, but they're not particularly expressionist works that you could see, and the relationship between rod, plane, solid, void, articulated in a very fine, with a very fine sensitivity to their individual identity, but at the same time, so it wasn't an installation in the sense that each of these small, modest scales objects kind of had a very strong sense of their own identity and kind of objecthood, but they all did talk to each other. They all kind of referred to each other in one way or another. And at that moment, and like Ingrid, I thought I was looking at the work of an artist, of a really rather wonderful artist, whose work I didn't know at all, and I was kind of ashamed that, because I think I know quite a lot, and I was kind of ashamed that I didn't know this work, and that I thought it should be better known, and throughout the following years, as I went back to Belgrade again and again to advance the project that I was working on, I continued to also try and find a way to bring some of this work. First I thought it was easy, you know, that we'd just grab the whole lot from the Serbian National Academy of Science and bring it over here, and it would be, you know, be done. It would be kind of a fantastic show. But it's not. It's never that simple. And I also, the only opportunity I had to kind of curate a show while Olga was still alive was a small show I did in Koblenz with some other artists, where we took a group of works from the other collection of Olga's works, which are in Belgrade Heritage House, which is a collection of larger works, and not and equally powerful, but harder to see. They're not installed with the same care, but yeah, so that's how it started for me, and it felt like a huge privilege that I'd come across this work.
Mm. And thank you. Wonderful. My experience was with Ingrid when we went to Belgrade together and wandered the streets to try and find the place where the work was being stored, which was the
Heritage House.
Belgrade
Heritage
No,
House.
it wasn't. It was in the library.
The basement of the university library.
Yes.
Which is
Heritage House. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
You have to get down three or four
flights of
floors
stairs.
down in
Yes.
it does feel very basement.
Yes, and into a pitch black basement and along a corridor that seemed to have no, it was like a Tarkovsky film. And then opening this door at the end and into this huge basement room. And I couldn't sort of see anything other than what looked like a heap of rubble at one end. And because all the work was stacked on pallets, so you're looking down on it. And I looked and had that sort of awful feeling that I couldn't actually see anything. It was most strange. I think it was just a huge emotional impact of seeing such lithe work in such restricted circumstances.
It was like it was in prison.
Yes, exactly. But gradually the works began to separate them out, and I feel that this is where I must sound incredibly arrogant. I felt I knew it, like the back of my hand. And I think it's because of my own experience of making sculpture beginning in 1960, where the tropes of sculpture were still very rooted in a very solid belief of sculpture, which the Jevrić work seemed to reflect. That maybe if one looks at what began to happen in the middle of the 20th century with sculpture, where sculpture was being opened up and the armature was being exposed and the flesh was being separated from the body. And you had that on one hand, and then you maybe had Garbo's extraordinary experiments with materials, so sculpture became transparent and full of holes. And somehow I felt I knew this language, and what I had inherited when I first started making sculpture at Chelsea was quite a didactic way of being taught sculpture, and I hated it. And the instinct was to rebel against it, even though during the 50s, when I began looking at sculpture, I absolutely loved this stuff. But when I began to be taught it as a method, the instinct was to reject it entirely. So I think it was a sort of emotional confusion to see this work, which brought back everything I'd experienced as a young student, of first of all being passionate about a language of sculpture that seemed so able to bring into the world completely new forms, completely new invented forms that reflected the human condition, but weren't figurative. They were about the inner body rather than the outer body. And suddenly to be looking at this work again having rejected it so vehemently in the early 60s. And maybe that conflicted emotion beginning to reveal itself. And I found that absolutely an extraordinary experience, and began to realize as I looked at the work that kind of what I would call work that's led by a formal language is not led by a subject. It's not led by a verbal language. It's led by something where maybe the thinking and the making are so incredibly united in some way that there isn't a space for verbal language to exist at that moment, which I think is quite different from our experience at looking at all sorts of sculpture and installation and the expanded field of sculpture, where maybe the voiceover, the narrative of the sculpture and the narrative of how objects which may have no relationship to sculpture, in fact, perform over the last 30 years, that maybe there's a kind of schism, a breakaway from that very, very powerful and what became quite doctrinaire approach to sculpture, where I think there were belief systems in sculpture, and that's where I enter sculpture at that point, and maybe where I turn so violently against it. But I've fallen passionately in love with it again, because I think it does, to me, show a massive cause for something where the subject is, there isn't a didactic subject. You've got to explore the work in a very visceral, sentient kind of way. In a way, you've got to almost become the work. And just talking to David before we came in, it was something I felt that you can feel the work coming from her cupped hand. There's that sort of sense that the process of the thinking about how to use those materials and where they've got impaled, are they impaled on the rods or are they clinging to the rods? All these uncertainties about how the work actually performs leaves us in this incredibly powerful state of having to actually be with the work rather than you're watching the work, you're not just looking at it. You're waiting in a way for something quite imminent to happen. And I think that sort of recovery of a language that maybe fell into disrepute can now begin to be looked at again afresh. And I think that's why it has this tremendous sense of that work being done today, because it's a language that's actually extremely traditional from my point of view about how to make sculpture. But we're seeing it in a way where it's not usual to see this kind of work. And also an artist who maybe has been difficult to locate because of all sorts of reasons. So there is a real sense of newness about it.
Do you think the one of the obvious points to start with is to think about the relationship between rod and lump?
Yeah.
And to try and, which actually I find quite impossible to do, to try and, as you said, whether they're stuck to it or kind of the exploded fragment seems to be a kind of a division that's almost impossible to make. It's hard to know, whereas armature precedes modelling. There is an ambiguity whether the lumps or the lumps is okay, but I'll put it in inverted commas, whether the lumps precede or follow the rods, and I mean sometimes the rods create a plane, and so they act like a kind of barrier. Sometimes the rods seem like they do impale the lumps. Other times they could be the thing that holds the lumps together. So there's this kind of extraordinary conversation between the texture of and they have this extraordinary materiality as well. The strangeness of the material which is used, which is in most cases a plaster that's had ferric oxide added to it, which, as far as I understand it, slightly slows down the process, but also makes it harder, and then it rushes through to give you, it gives a colour. So there's the plaster is, or in some very few cases concrete, is both moulded and scraped. So the and it's very subtle, the relationship that is set up between between the two entities, whichever has which has the more definite presence. It's kind of very subtle balance between the two.
Do you think the work? Do you think she? I mean, what I feel looking at the work is that the sort of that it didn't. There isn't a sense of image as a pre-thought identity for the work. Something happens with that very simple and quite well-known method of making sculpture, which is armature, this flesh and bone approach, where the armature is a structure on which a material is adhered or hung or slung at or whatever it is. But in her case, it's as though there's a lot of thinking in the moment, that the things aren't pre-planned. So the impaling of the lumps and then the clutching at the lumps is simultaneous. You know, both things can happen in any one work.
Yeah, I mean, I think they can be, the lump can be drilled and and a rod inserted, or equally the rod can be, the lump can be formed around two crossing rods, or a rod can be sawn off and moved somewhere else. And the but and even the lump can then become a plane in some places.
Do you think she worked with light as well? The way these works seem to me to be incredibly sensitive to light and dark and to the voids that surround them. There's a kind of energy, the absence of lumps is as important as the lump itself. Do you think her...
No, I'm going to cheat. Phyllida. This is from the transcript of the film. There's a very nice film where she talks about the work. And she said, in the mythologies of almost all nations, light is experienced as a secret of life. In the work of every creator, the myth of becoming developed through indicating the separation of light from darkness, which is, I suppose, what you were saying.
Yeah. Which, in my opinion, makes the work defy image, because that changing of light and dark means there's never a single viewing point. There's a constantly shifting viewing point as the light and dark comes and goes around the work. And I think that's what makes it have this very distinctive and, I think, in a way, very traditional sculptural language.
Well, they're sculptures. So, and we have the advantage here of being able to walk around them. Actually, in that experience that I was describing in the Academy of Sciences, then that's really not so strongly the case, since the works are in the are on the shelves. But they're sculptures, so they have different points of view, and they look different according to which
yes, where
place
you
you look at them from. There is a change which happens when she adopts a kind of module, that kind of brick-like little rectangular blocks, where the block and the which I kind of interpreted as being the moment when the rod and the lump kind of fuse together into one into one thing. So in those later works, although ostensibly they're actually very simple, but you're kind of seeing two things at once. You're seeing both a lump and a rod, and because of their kind of precarious nature of their balance in some cases, there is the structure becomes less of a an issue, or less of a...
Yes, yeah, they to me become more about a potential to be our size or larger than us. They seem to be wanting to become something else, which I think maybe lies behind a lot of the work, that it has a great desire to reach up and beyond our own size, so it would become something else. But I don't know whether she ever was able to make the work any larger than the ones that we see.
There are bigger ones, yes. There are bigger ones. But scale is also an issue, and and it kind of did bedevil all of that, a lot of that sculpture,
Right.
The historical sculpture that you mentioned, in the Henry Moore thing about scaling up until it fits its right size, and they can look inflated, when they get bigger, and they lose that character of the relationship between the mark and the surface becomes less to do with what you can do individually, and it becomes a kind of less to do with a kind of factoring of the surface, and more something that becomes a little bit decorative in relationship to the surface. You're very good at making bigger things look like they've been handmade at a kind of at a much larger scale. So you're very good at maintaining that kind of facture within the work.
Thank you. You are too. But there's a loss of immediacy, isn't there, when things get bigger and are given over to other people.
Well, they take longer to make. So
But can I ask you about the sculpture thing? I mean, I'm sort of surprised by. I think it's true that so many people have said they look as though they're made today, because to me they belong so much to a historical trajectory that I think although they look incredibly fresh, I see them as rooted absolutely in the sort of dark centre of European sculpture. And that absolutely intrigues me. It's something that I don't see a great deal of today, and if I do see it, it's usually in a very kitsch form, in some really awful kind of public art type of sculpture, but it seems that this work does have this remarkable freshness, as though it is incredibly much of today. And is that because the time is right to see this kind of work that doesn't have such a strong subject attached to it? I don't know what the subject of the work is, and that's what I love about it. It's very liberated from a verbal language and a sort of verbal definition. It's the language that I speak about it is very non-precise. You know, I was talking about sentience and emotion and all those kind of banned words critically, because they don't have that precision about them. But I think it's fascinating that, to me, it also is unashamedly a sculptural language because of that way one circumnavigates it and the way the light affects it and the fact that it has transparency and solidity, and we're left in a way quite abandoned with it, as though we in a way don't know where it quite belongs, because it is a very new form to be looking at. It isn't like anything that we see around us now.
Okay, well, I can answer that. But okay, I think that a lot of the sculpture from the 40s and the 50s was terribly compromised by bronze casting.
Yes.
And so all of that kind of integrity factor and stuff, which is then transferred into a bronze casting process, cut things off from their roots, and I, as a student, I thought that Donald Judd was the solution to that. That his ability to make the material work in the things that he made was a way through that problem. Of course, he did employ other means of making, but the material remained as a significant component in the work. And what I think is interesting, or what I think is engaging with Olga Jevrić work, and what gives it its contemporaneity, is that material facture that is still evident, that isn't lost by being transferred to another process. So what makes Sarah Lucas's work interesting is, and it's not dissimilar from some of the aspects of this, or any number of other younger sculptors, is that desire to retain facture within the work. So this is were those Lipchitz bronzes, or which are interesting, and they're lovely things to look at, but they're dated. They're stuck in their time warp, and the Laurence, whose work also has some connection with this. Then, so that's why I think they retain their. It also has to do with them being kind of, you not being familiar with the work as well, and you're suddenly confronted with a really rich body of work you don't know, and so it kind of, wow, this is kind of really something. But were what is on show appear a selection of bronze casts, then they wouldn't have anything like the same
Yes, I think that's...
And there's also, and that conversation is also enhanced by the little rocks, that they're fragments of stone, that the things are, that a number of them are placed on, which are ambiguous as to whether they're bases or integral parts of the work, or there's particularly a very nice two-part rectangular block one, which sits on a little lump of kind of grey-green stone, where the combination of the three is really, you know, of the three elements is really fantastic. So I didn't go through the same education as you did. I went through a completely different experience, which we've discussed quite previously. But but I always found it puzzling that you set out to make a piece of sculpture, and then it gets switched into something else, and that's and that always seemed like a kind of something I didn't understand, and I suppose I still don't. But but certainly when I in my 20s, you know, it was something I was really kind of resistant to as and wanted to find a way through that.
Yes.
That.
I wanted to make sculpture, and I had, at the same time, I felt resistant to the way I was being taught sculpture. I'm extremely grateful for it now, because I think it's has always given me great independence. But at the time it seemed incredibly restrictive. But there was something about the bringing or making something that hadn't existed in the world before, that had this need to be seen 360 degrees, and each way of viewing it was different, that I was completely intrigued by. And it seemed that sculpture had a language, sculptural language, and gradually, as the 60s progressed, that language expanded and became more and more generous in what it could be materially and what it could be in terms of content. So that film became sculpture, performance became sculpture, and I mean, everybody knows this, so I don't want to bore people, but I think that releasing that experience of a three-dimensional lump, for want of a better word, was, in a way, for me, quite traumatic. There was something about it that I wanted to hang on to, and yet everything, in a way, was conspiring to fracture it and demolish it and to turn it into something else. And therefore, artists like Mario Merz or Pannoni, I mean, a lot of Italian artists, they were the ones that I looked to. I found Donald Judd too rigid. I found, also, I suppose, I found it incredibly domineering. It was like another belief system. Him and Robert Morris and Sarah. I mean, I think they were in a way magnificent. I saw them as magnificent, but I couldn't tolerate them. And I found the whole idea of minimalism. I don't quite know where I'm going with this. I'm glad somebody laughed. No, I hated them. No, but I think it was just trying to escape from things that came with incredibly strong belief systems and messages that seemed to, I found daunting. And yet the very thing I wanted was this sculptural object that I saw something quite either something quite solid or something that had opened itself up in some way, that had a sort of, I suppose, a kind of sexuality about it. And so much of the belief system seemed to be laying down rules. And I think my need to escape from that was very much rooted in what I'd been taught. But I think you're absolutely right about the bronze, you know, that the bronze, if these works had all been in bronze, it would have been a completely different, well, obviously a very, very different way of seeing that
Yeah, so
work.
it's not just form that's important, it's what things are made of.
What things are made of and how they are made,
how
and
they're
that,
made
that bronze
that is important.
destroys something about how something is made, you know.
Yes.
And, yeah.
I think you're wrong about Judd, but
But I think going to Marfa is extraordinary. I've been there.
yes, and the
I think
artillery sheds is a kind of completely transcendent experience. And actually those early Judds with the baking tin and with the
oh yes, yes.
with
yeah, they
they're really amazing works. And in that Tate show in '68, what was it called? The Art of the Real. Thank you. I thought I knew stuff, but the Judds I didn't understand, and I thought that was really, they were. So as a 19-year-old to find something that you thought you were looking at and you didn't understand,
exactly.
I thought was
yes.
was very strong. I also think we need to say a little bit about. So Olga Jevrić in the 50s was not an unknown artist. She travelled widely in the States. She got a prize at Venice in '57.
Yes, yeah.
And had and did have contacts outside Yugoslavia and interest in her work. A combination of political circumstances, I think, took opportunities away from her. But also the context in which the society in which she was working was optimistic, socialist society. Yugoslavia under Tito had an independence of mind and ambition of a technological ambition. There was some very sophisticated technologies being developed, and so there was and also a rather extensive support for artists to produce work, and at the same time, her studio, which she occupied for a long time, was on the. You didn't go to the studio. The studio was. The studio was in the buildings that were used for the World's Fair in 1936, and from which the very first television broadcast was made, and then those buildings then became a concentration camp in during the war, and so the place in which she was working had this kind of also kind of extraordinary mix of future hope and future horror, kind of mixed into it. And so the building she worked in was a kind of a modernist pavilion, but at the same time it had this kind of very dark kind of history attached to it. So there is within the within the, I don't think the work is particularly expressionist or whatever, but there are, and I think the conversations in the work are about dark and light, but dark and light does bleed over into other things. It's not, darkness is not just darkness, and light is not just lightness, and so, and the, you know, the even kind of horizontal blocks aren't necessarily just horizontal blocks. They can be other things. They can be dead, or they can be alive.
Yeah.
You know, so all of those things are kind of flittering around the fringes of the work. They occasionally you look at it and you think explosion, or an inversion of an explosion, kind of, and
they remain
those remain on the edges, but they sort of come in and come out as you look at it, as you look at the work, which I think is what makes them interesting to look at, or kind of you know,
but
demanding to, rewarding to look at, not interesting, rewarding to look at, is that you can construct a meaning which then can dissipate, and you're looking at at something else.
Yeah, I think those the way I find myself looking at them is that there isn't a constant, that having found something that looks as if it's all being drawn in, the next turn it's falling out. So there's an constant unfixing. And I think, again, that is a language. And I think it's what the meaning is, I don't know. And I think that's one of the great powerful things about the work. I don't think the meaning is something that can be summed up, because I think it's experiential. Every time you find a point where you're looking at the work, the next point will in a way refute that or change it. And I think that is what a language that she uses is so extraordinarily powerful at being able to do. I think it is very difficult to make work where there isn't a preconceived image in your head about what that work is going to be. I think it's
I find it very difficult to make a work that has a preconceived image.
You find it?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to make a work with a preconceived image. So if I know what it's going to turn out like, then I think it's then I can hardly begin. So it's but I think meaning. I think the potential. The works have potential for meaning, and that meaning is a discursive thing.
Yes,
and
exactly.
You can never pin it down. The capacity for something to hold meaning is, I think, a wonderful thing, and because all it is plaster and iron powder, and
meaning doesn't necessarily have to belong to verbal language, does it?
No, you can not in it.
So I think the same thing for me. I'm never quite sure what an image is when it comes to talking about sculpture.
Okay.
You know, when you say you find it very hard to make a work with an image in mind,
yes,
is the image a static thing, or is it already something that you can walk around or turn around in your head? Sorry.
Image. Okay. So I think. Okay. I think the. I think I do have images in my head. If I try and put it down on paper, then it's kind of boring, really. What I do, it's really bad. Henry Moore seemed to be able to do it very well, you know, and but I can't but I find it kind of kills things if I do it like that. And it's interesting in relationship to Olga Jevrić is that I know very few drawings.
I think that's extraordinary.
I've seen,
Yeah.
I know photographs. There was an exhibition
Yes.
of her photographs, which are photographs. Actually, they do look quite like Twombly's photographs. They have the same kind of quality as
Yeah, I've seen some,
as Twombly's
yeah.
photographs, you know,
Yes.
kind of, which is starting to get a lot of attention now. As the kind of supply of new Twomblys dries up, they kind of start to look at Twombly the photographer, and the I don't know to what extent the photographs, and they are generally photographs of, and in funny colours as well. They're I remember a photograph of a kind of whole group of peppers is one that I was struck by, but with a kind of pinky background from the kind of
Yes.
processing of the film. They're not, and it is something that sculptors worry about, is, you know, what's in a photograph, what's and painters do as well. But, you know, that's the only. But other than that, drawings, you know, I don't know.
But was the actions of making a kind of drawing for her as well? I mean, we don't know.
I don't know
but,
that.
No.
You know, I don't know that,
But it
so.
seems to me there's that kind of directness in the work.
She did play music, and she did listen to a lot of music, and was a very accomplished pianist. But that's
Really?
different
God.
from
Didn't know that.
from drawing. Although there might be some connection. I've often envied the ability of musicians to rehearse,
Yes.
which I think, and I find that quite.
Yes.
That, as an artist, I don't know how to rehearse.
Practice.
Yeah, how to practice. You know what?
Yeah.
What
I don't know. I think I do practice, actually. Yeah, I think I do understand that
Yeah,
you can
exactly.
keep on trying at something.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Fedja, are there any drawings?
Very, very few, but photographs are kind of drawings, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't say that they're great photographs, but...
No, they're not
she
great
took-
photographs.
But she did lots of them, and I think they're, you know, they are kind of sort of sketchbook for her. She did lots of drawings of her trips, of things, of buildings, stuff like that, but nothing directly connected to her work. There are some. But she graduated at Music Academy first.
Yes.
Yes.
In
Yeah,
1946.
of course I remember.
So she was an accomplished pianist. But she developed these painful cramps early on, so she gave up. But she always listened to music, played music. I mean, last time when I went with Frances there, she was playing Vivaldi on this older tape recorder. What I was going to say, something else. Yes, so she graduated first piano, and she gave it up. So it was a kind of sculptural substitute, really, for using her hands. And when you talk about palm of her hands, and loads of these small works were really size of her hands, that was kind of, for me, substitute. And I first saw them in '82 in Museum of Contemporary Art as a young man. I thought they are kind of sort of deconstructed piano. Yeah. What you have in belly of the piano, those bats and wires that kind of create the sound. And they do resonate in that sort of way. I always connected her work to music. And she talks about it. She talks about it a lot.
What music did she listen to?
Well, I mean, mostly it would be Baroque. I mean, it was Vivaldi when we went to her studio. But in this film, it was filmed to do with this exhibition in '82, I asked a friend of mine who made it, Dragomir Zupan, said, do you know about this music? I mean, who's chosen the music? She said, Olga did. And it's Pink Floyd.
It's Pink Floyd.
You know, I mean, so I was very, very surprised by that. I remember seeing film many, many years ago, but not until recently I saw it again, and I thought, wow, this is extraordinary.
But
there's so many things around. I mean, there's been loads of things written back home there, but it's what's important now that we have this exhibition here, and that this work can be seen with some different eyes, and you two particularly talking about it. Now Tate just brought also with this lot 9 pieces that they acquired, and I think that's going to help to further evaluate Olga Jevrić's work and put her in the context of post-European sculpture, a place where she really deserves. There are loads of things to be researched, and there's going to be for young people to go to States and see what she was doing in year 66. She spent whole year there. She met loads of people. I know that she had a lunch with Naum Gabo in his house outside New York. I mean, she told me last time we saw her that she met Louise Bourgeois then. There was an idea of exhibition with her and David Smith. Tate has a very good collection of David Smith. It would be interesting maybe putting it together with 2 of them. But David Smith is now in Yorkshire Sculpture Park, so it's really interesting kind of how everything kind of slotting nicely together.
Yeah, and the David's actually the person you would also slightly connect with Olga Jevrić is Lynn Chadwick, who was with David Smith at Volta, and they got on very well together, him and David Smith. But that Pink Floyd was also the soundtrack for Zabriskie Point, which I don't know how many of you have seen Zabriskie Point. It has that kind of fantastic end sequence of the house blowing up and the contents of the refrigerator kind of descending slowly through the rose-tinted air.
And also those rock formations.
And
Have you been to the Zabriskie Point? I mean, it's
yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. And those
So
rock formations are very much to do with what
it's actually a very interesting film to think about in relationship to the work there, which is and takes it out of that sort of 50s context.
The other thing, if I just may, I don't want to take over, stop me, but the bronze business. At the beginning, she did plan to cast all these works in bronze. She couldn't afford it. She was always playing down importance of material in her work. She was talking about constructing and building and all that, but never material. And lucky that she didn't turn them into bronzes. Could be disaster. Later on,
you don't have to believe what artists say. That's, I mean,
later on, I think she realized that this kind of peroxide mixture with cement, which is predominantly her material, was her material. But also she experimented with a variety of other things. I talked to Richard about some of them, which is the spraying of the metals, which is technique which was used in 50s in shipbuilding or covering planks of wood, but not clay. And that's what she was telling us. She was very secretive about the process of making. She wouldn't talk about it at all. So there is a bit of mystery about how some of these works are made, and I have good examples of them in our show. And we have 2 smaller versions of 2 bronzes which are in this show here. Okay, sorry.
I think we can pass the mic round. Fedja, that's brilliant. Fedja's an absolute font of knowledge about Olga Jevrić, so it's great we probably will go back to it. I've got one question before I start handing the mic around, which is, could you maybe say something about, because you were both very much involved in helping to design the exhibition. If you've seen the film that's on it here, but it's also on her website, that Fedja mentioned, it's made in 1982. It's the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, where she's walking around her big solo exhibition, talking about the work, with the Pink Floyd in the background. And you can see that all of her work is displayed, single sculptures put on white painted plinths. And you've decided to not do that with the work. So maybe would you like to say something a bit about the thought process behind the display?
There isn't room in Pier to have individual works on white painted plinths. And in the Academy of Sciences, it's clear that the works can coexist together on shelves, so that the possibilities of grouping is there in that display of her works. She was a very small woman, and the height of the plinths that she uses, I think, reflect her eye height. So we felt that we would respect that, but there are adjustments you can make, because the height which things are obviously changes what you see and how you see it. And the inclusion in Pier of one work which sits directly on the ground, which was also shown directly on the ground, the one with a kind of triangular steel thing.
I think the sight lines were very important, weren't they? In
Yes,
setting,
and
and it was quite tricky, actually, wasn't it, when we were setting them up, that it wasn't just a question of having the largest ones at the back, it was actually trying to get that through view so that you did feel you could walk, circumnavigate the space very fluidly.
Probably we have too many of them, but still I think it's looking good.
Yes.
yeah, and so and if the plinths were painted white, given the number of works we have, then it would become, it would take away, I think, from the work. So it's a pity she's not here to answer that question.
I think it's fascinating that she wanted to have them cast in bronze, because I mean that is part of the tyranny of the times, I think. And I think to me the tragedy of seeing so many of the bourgeois works cast in bronze, I don't know, I find it, and even the Richier, German Richier works, there is a sort of destructive element that bronze has. And I know the Tate is doing the Rodin show and showing the plasters, and you know his need to have his sense of his, what is called his autobiography, seen in the work right to the bitter end, went against the whole grain of what bronze casters were doing. And I think it's that will be a fascinating show.
Olga's teacher at the Art Academy, Serfis Jovanovic, was studying at Burdel, and he was a pupil of Rodin.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh. That's extraordinary.
Okay, I still think that you don't have to believe what artists say, and that someone who devises a material from which to make their own work doesn't necessarily indicates one level of importance that she attaches to the things that they're made of, and saying I can't afford to make them in bronze is maybe not quite, what does can't afford mean in that sense? I can't afford because I can't afford what is lost. I can't afford it because it costs too much money. You know,
I can't afford to risk my reputation by making them from.
whatever, you know, yeah. So I think they're kind of incredibly materially specific, and which is a part of what makes them sing for me.
Yes.
Does anybody have any other thoughts or responses to the work that they would like to share?
First of all, thank you both. As a fulsome round of thanks to you as possible. It's this element of time that I wanted to touch on that I think perhaps could be elaborated a little bit. Partly from
element of time.
Time. Partly from things she says in this very illuminating film. For instance, from a spiritual perspective, time is circling, she says. Every present moment touches somewhere this time and before our time. So, as with the point you made, Richard, about light, there's a temporal, physical aspect to what she has to say about light, and I think same about time. There's a material aspect of time passing, but I think there's a metaphorical, metaphysical dimension to this too. But also, I only noticed this evening that time enters in a very real way into the making of some of these sculptures. Some of them over 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, or I think 15 years in one case. And I wondered if you might both like to comment in terms of making sculpture about that aspect of time being embodied in what becomes a fixed object.
It is noticeable that some of these really quite small objects have, as you say, a kind of 3 or 4 year gestation attached to them. And you do slightly wonder how you could take so long to make something so small. Though Howard Hodgkin would come in as an example of someone who could also take a long time to make a small thing. Phyllida mentioned Tarkovsky at the beginning, which seems quite a kind of interesting comparison, because the book is sculpting with time, and time is a kind of funny thing in relationship to sculpture, because it is involved in and both the duration of the activity and the sense that, of course, you're working with space, but if you're working with space, you're working with time. At its simplest, you kind of walk around something, it takes you a while to do that. It's hard to know how time comes into things. At the end of that film, after the quote you've just said, she says, "I travel to the end of infinity, towards the new beginning," and which then puts her in a kind of slightly sort of astral traveling Marina Abramovich crystal shoes category, which I don't know if you've ever worn any of
Yes.
Marina Abramovich's crystal shoes. They're excruciatingly uncomfortable, and you
Yes.
don't really go anywhere. But I think it's a hard question you've asked, David.
But isn't there also the time, I mean, Louise Bourgeois talks about this as well, the time that materials like plaster, you've got to work with a very specific time, which is its time. It's not going to wait for you to worry and fuss about it. So in a way that it already demands a kind of very direct way of thinking and a very direct way of being in tune with what you've got to use, because the stuff sets solid. And I think that's a remarkable thing about those kinds of materials, cement, plaster, you know, materials that go from powder to liquid to solid. Sounds like a digestive process, but it's a making process. And I think it's that, so there's another force in control. And I think that brings, in a way, that metaphysical time scale in, because your thinking has to do something in relationship with something that has its own life cycle. And
perhaps that cyclical aspect is precisely what you were on to, Phyllida, about the work coming back into another time of its own.
yes, yeah, maybe,
with the passage of time.
Yes, passage of time.
photography involves time as well.
Yes.
I just want to pick up on the issue of time in relation to the historical time, because Olga didn't only finish Music Academy, she finished Visual Arts Academy and the History of Arts. So we are talking about the scholar who has been part of Serbian Academy of Sciences as one of 3 women at the time when she entered. That was pretty remarkable. And the evidence of it is in the film that is on the website, because the way that she articulates her practice is absolutely incredible. And nowadays, at least us academics who are teaching at various arts academies are having this as a major problem with our students, the importance of articulating the practice, the transfer of that knowledge and significance to our students is, to this day, incredibly problematic for them to take seriously. And it took Olga to places which are unimaginable now for an artist from Serbia. In relation to that historical time, I also want to say that she was first and foremost a Yugoslav artist. And that is really important, because I'm not sure that somebody like Marina Abramović would be able to class herself as such or wanted to do so. But in Olga's work, you can see the relationship to this historical time. She is talking about representing the struggle of the Second World War in particular. She was interested in the fallen. She was interested in the violence of the time. She was interested in the strength that came out of the ashes of the Second World War. And she's looking at the new country. In a way, she is a representative of Yugoslavia, which is why she exhibited at the Venice Biennale as one of the people of Yugoslavia. And funnily enough, I've been in the Biennale just a week ago, and to see that Yugoslav pavilion exists, it's actually a building, and those 6 new states are struggling to have their artists represented in that place is somehow a condition which I think Olga would be very disappointed by. And I know that in the last 10 years of her life, the shattering of this ideal of brotherhood and unity that kind of collected Yugoslav states and kept Yugoslav states together as republics under this kind of veil of Yugoslavia was something that really deeply disturbed her, because she spoke about the cultural values being lost, the cultural value of the whole country, in a way that doesn't tackle nationalism that the countries are now obsessed by. I mean, I guess it's a world trend. It's not only something that exists in the Balkans, but her work is clearly philosophical and goes beyond that, much, much more beyond that. And I must say that it makes me really proud to be from that part of the world in a way that Marina Abramović never made me feel proud, simply because it seems that there is an artist that could be a visionary and have ethical stands in terms of understanding the power of art and what it can do to generations of people after her in a way that I haven't seen with the many artists. So I've been really touched to find out that her work is exhibited here in London, to be able to take other people into this kind of knowledge. And I'm hoping in Serbia it could be framed in a way of Yugoslav art rather than the kind of national treasure which it tends to be at times.
I think you're, having been to Belgrade a lot, I think time is a material in Belgrade in ways that it's not in many other places. This is a city that is continually from Roman times, continually destroyed, rebuilt, and the 20th century history is savage and also optimistic, and then savage again. So to go from the concentration camps of to go from the World's Fair to the concentration camps to the to Yugoslavia, the building of New Belgrade, to Milosevic, to Srebrenica, etc. Is time is a morass, and finding out and to I went to the on that first visit to the National Museum. I also went into the city archive, and the archives of the city of Belgrade were in a dust-covered room, piled up on tables and kept in the most appalling conditions, and the memory was clearly being, if not destroyed, being allowed to deteriorate, so to answer in a way David's question, time is also to do with memory and to do with the ways in which and to do with, as you've so succinctly pointed out, navigating through the marshes of nationalism to maintain a sense of integrity and optimism within, and to locate yourself within the city, is within your home city, is an extraordinary act of bravery. And what we get out of it is not bitter. There's no bitterness in the work that we have there. It may be dark in places, but it's not bitter.
No.
I think we haven't got time for one more question, but let's make time for one more question, just a brief one, if anybody has anything burning that they would like to ask.
There's something I'd like to say. I've said a lot, but the book that we're due to publish with Writing House comes about through a lot of people's efforts and desires to make it happen. I think it's very important that it does happen. This is the last book that Carsten Schubert looked at and okayed before he died. He did a fantastic job in Writing House, and it's a big loss. And the book that we're due to publish is an abiding memory. Thank you, Writing House. Thank you, Carsten.
Yes.
Phyllida, can you tell us what you meant by the dark centre of European sculpture?
I said a short question.
I think the work that was produced before the war, and then especially after the war, and there was a wonderful exhibition at the Barbican called Aftermath. I don't know if anyone remembers that. And it showed a lot of people like Etienne Martin and Dubuffet, and it seemed to reveal this burden of trouble, really, that found its expression in quite heavy formal language, very curvaceous forms, very, in a way, quite dark forms. And I think that was also beginning in some of the work that happened before the war as well, but I think it especially came to fruition in the 50s. And I think it was a dark language. I think, oddly enough, I went back to Paris with my family. My parents wanted to catch up with people they knew in France before the war. And we went to visit a friend, they're called the Lalans. I don't think anyone will know them, very odd people who, she made the jewelry for Yves Saint Laurent and he made all these strange furniture. We went to his studio in the very famous Rue Ronsin Studios. And I think I was 5 or 6 at the time. And just the impact going to that studio had on me, but I just remember Paris, and I was talking to my brother about it yesterday, and we both remember it as this absolutely flattened city. And weirdly then, I mean, this isn't quite answering your question, but I think the darkness in that devastation is something which is ingrained either as an inherited memory or as an actual memory for so many of us. I don't know, does that answer the question to some extent or not?
That's the beginning of the answer.
Yes.
That's pretty good beginning.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Dark Heart is kind of. It's hard. The Arts Council produced a very good film with David Sylvester on Giacometti.
Yes, brilliant.
And it has very good footage of Giacometti modelling. And the soundtrack is excessively expressionistic. But if you turn the sound off, it looks, it's completely different. And when I was a student, I watched this. I had a copy of this film. I watched it a lot, and with the sound off. And it was the two-handed modelling.
Oh, yes.
That was the interesting
flickering
thing.
Fingers.
And you put the soundtrack on, and it became momentous and kind of meaningful in a way that when you turned it off, it had a kind of detachment and a kind of thing. So that, Herbert Reed's claws scuttling across the ocean floor colours the way you think about certain things, which is not necessarily the case. But then darkness it depends on what you mean by darkness, whether you mean it's a bad thing or a void.
I think it's a weight. It has weight to it. It's a presence. I think working with darkness in making sculpture is an extraordinary, I think seeing sculpture in the dark. Alison Wilding and I used to always talk about that. It would be fantastic to have exhibitions where you have sculpture in the dark, because there is a sort of sensory experience of coming up against something and you don't know what is actually there in front of you, like when power cuts happen.
Yes.
And I think I'm talking about...
Yeah, 1972, miners' strike.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah,
1972.
2, 3, 4.
72. I did my, I wrote my thesis for my DipAD by candlelight, in the dark. And I lived in a, at the time I lived in a very small bedsit. It was quite a kind of, it was quite a bad time in my life, but it had a window, and the window looked out onto a brick wall. And in daylight, this was really quite depressing. But at night, the black space actually became
alive.
Really alive.
Yeah.
Something that was so. Yes, darkness doesn't have to be. So
Yes.
sitting there by candlelight, with looking out in the dark, was really quite uplifting.
In the darkness of his bedsit and
See the darkness.
Yeah, Patrick Heron's
Oh, yes.
exhibition at the Tate, where Nick let it go dark. Very
Brilliant.
very really brilliant.
the one just recently, you mean? Yes. Well,
When was it, Nick?
Andrew was...
but also the one last year.
Yes.
No, not the one.
Was allowed to go dark. So anyway, we've migrated from Olga Jevrić, but thank you very much, Phyllida and Richard, for your very wonderful, insightful, and honest and intriguing responses to the work.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. And the book will be out in November, and keep an eye on the PEER website about the publication date, and I hope you all rush to buy a copy. Yes, thank you very much. It's been a great evening.
And my thanks. My thanks to you, Ingrid, and to Fedja
Yes.
for making these two exhibitions.